Mr. Peter Hain.
Thank you, Mr. Chope, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. On Thursday, the 15th of September 2011, 7 men left their homes and commuted to work at the Gleision pit in my Neath constituency. Having drunk their morning tea, at just after 9, they moved underground to labour on the number 2 Rhondda seam. Wearing high-visibility jackets and safety gear, they expected to work until 5 and then return to their families. Instead, at 9:45 a.m., a small explosion they detonated led to the release in a matter of seconds of 3,000 tons of water into a shaft hardly 4 feet high. The exact sequence of events is unknown, but the mine manager, Malcolm Fifield, was close to the inrush. Astonishingly, he was able to survive the torrent of water and climb through the breach hole, finally to emerge bloodied, having struggled out of another entrance to the mine. Further from the beach, David Wyatt heard the roar from the coming torrent and ran until he was able to jump upon a conveyor belt which carried him to the main mine entrance, the water chasing him through the passage. There he alerted his colleague, Nigel Evans, and the emergency services were called. Daniel Powell, another collier in the mine, was also lucky to escape after rushing from the inrush. These 3 were the only men to survive. Charles Breslin, Philip Hill, Gary Jenkins, and David Powell were crushed by the terrifying, raging force of the flood. With nearly a century of mining experience between them, these colliers had laboured in mines across the Swansea, Neath, and Dullice valleys all of their working lives. Charles Breslin had returned from retirement for a stint down Gleision to earn extra money to complete the family home he was building. In the immediate hours after the explosion, teams from across Britain came to the fore as emergency services from Dinas, Cumgrach, Gleneath, and even Yorkshire rushed to help in a frantic rescue operation and the subsequent investigation. Down the mountain in Ross Community Centre, the families of the trapped men gathered with community leaders in a 36-hour vigil until, in turn, the miners' bodies were eventually recovered, gradually identified, and everyone began to come to terms with the trauma, the families with their stunned grief. But today, over 3 years on, we are no closer to being told by any of the key agencies or the justice system why Charles, David, Philip, and Gary died. This is not an exercise, Mr. Chope, in finding someone to blame. There was a trial, and the manager and mine owners were acquitted of manslaughter and corporate manslaughter, respectively. Mining is inherently dangerous. Yet neither the families nor I, present over those long hours in that sad vigil in Ross Community Centre, have been given answers to why the accident occurred by the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, the Health and Safety Executive, or indeed the trial in Swansea County Court earlier this year. Therefore, I'm left to make my own judgment after careful assessment of the trial evidence and other inquiries. Of course.
Can I congratulate my honourable friend, right honourable friend, for bringing this to Westminster Hall. Can my honourable friend say what happened at the inquest for these individuals? Because normally, and I've been involved with deaths in the mining industry all of my life, unfortunately, normally there's some sort of indication from an inquest how individuals actually died.
He speaks, Mr. Chope, with a great deal of authority as a former leader of the Mine Workers Union. But the coroner's inquest was convened and then adjourned and has never completed the inquest, which has left also unanswered questions. The Gleision tragedy was a chilling reminder of a death-strewn mining era long thought consigned to history, that shortcut attitudes to health and safety can be fatal. It also revealed how the erosion of the mine's rescue service could create greater tragedies in the future if we fail to address the formidable budget challenges that key agency currently faces to maintain its long and dedicated record on mining. The first lesson is that employers must be responsible for their employees in a way that was obviously not the case at Gleision. Throughout its recent life, it appears that there was illegal mining at Gleision, certainly in the decade prior to 2011. At the trial, Mr. Justice Wynne Williams said that successive managers had read into health and safety regulations what suited their needs, failing to cooperate sufficiently with the Mines Inspectorate. Despite this, the mines inspectors confirmed that the mine plan from which manager and 4 men were working, even as they detonated the fatal blast, was accurate. The inspectors checked during the official investigation after the tragedy and found that although Gleision had not been inspected in the 16 months prior to the accident, an attempt to do so had been foiled by bad weather, the survey conducted 2 months before, in July 2011, by mine surveyor John Brosnan, was up to date and sufficiently accurate. Of course, the 1996 Management and Administration of Safety and Health at Mines regulations made it incumbent upon the mine manager or owner to inform the Mines Inspectorate of any major changes in working plans underground. The Mines Inspectorate relies on the mutual cooperation of the mine manager and mine owner to alert them to changes in the faces they see, and is more than likely that multiple Gleision managers before Malcolm Fifield had failed to adequately and properly do this. The entire legal framework of health and safety at work in Britain is sensibly based on a self-policing model, relying on the companies and their executives to comply with and guarantee safety standards by keeping risk as low as reasonably practicable. But it's clear to me in the events leading up to the tragedy, the regulations were not complied with. But the most frustrating question, the one which truly haunts us all, is why were the 4 miners there facing death in the first place? The day after the tragedy, having been escorted from Ross Community Centre up the mountain to stand at the mine entrance amidst rescue workers and police, the mines inspector showed me the same mine plan from which Fifield and the men were working. It showed clearly that they were mining directly towards an area in the old mine workings marked Old Central Workings and Underground Water. I have the mine plan here. The mines inspector expressed his surprise at this, and there is still no explanation for why the decision to take that risk was made. The exact source of the water, whether it was in the area marked on the plan as I saw, only a few meters from where the men fatefully detonated their explosion, or somewhere else nearby, became hotly disputed during the trial. Yet the fact remains that the water was indeed there, exactly as marked upon the mine plan, and that it killed them. Mines inspectors investigating the accident afterwards confirmed its presence coincided with the markings on the plan I saw. Indeed, they were able to see the high tide mark previously reached by the water, which had subsequently raged torrentially through the breach.
David Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. Can I congratulate my old friend for this, sadly, having to bring this debate to this place today. Is the truth that this is not a one-off? Some of the regulations regarding water ingress into mines have been developed through tragedies like this in the past. There was one in the 1970s at Horton Main in Yorkshire, and exactly the same discussions took place then. That's one of the reasons why things like mapping out water, where water was lying, was built into the inspection regimes. That's why it's very, very clear that these plans should be checked and looked at regularly and not just cast to one side.
I agree with my honourable friend, and he again speaks with great authority as a former miner himself. Mr. Fifield, the mines manager, who was the mines manager, is a highly respected and experienced manager. And he told the court that he went around into the old workings to check the presence of water marked on the plan and found none. Somehow, there was a catastrophic misjudgment. The water was indeed there, and it nearly killed him, just as it killed the 4 miners. Built into the regulations is a statutory procedure which could have prevented all of this. A precautions against inrush scheme would surely have given the men an indication of the presence of the water. There can be no question that it should have been implemented, because the 1979 mines regulations demand that if moving towards a suspected hazard, a PAI scheme must be created. These were all experienced miners, led by an expert and experienced mine manager. Yet the health and safety executive have not yet explained Neither has the trial evidence nor the verdict explained why this crucial regulation was not followed. Whether motivated by cost-cutting or simply the result of a cataclysmically mistaken judgment, the decision was taken to blast too close to the water, and 4 men died as a consequence, the manager only narrowly escaping to emerge so bloodied, severely injured and traumatized that he needed intensive hospital care to get back on his feet. In 2011, the mine safety expert Dave Frykert claimed that it was possible to have a no-fatality mining industry in the UK, such was the strength of HSE regulations. Yet at Gleision, these were ignored. In my view, that is the truth which should have been established by the trial and never was. Although the verdict is the verdict, it delivered neither justice nor accountability to the victims of the tragedy and to their families. They have all been failed by both the justice system and also by the absence of a full coroner's inquest. It was only through the immense efforts of the fantastic Mines Rescue Service, together with Walter Energy and Unity Mines close to the Gleision in the Neath Valley, which, unlike now, were fully operating at the time, that the bodies were recovered and the accident could be fully investigated. After the tragedy in 2011, in an open letter to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, I warned of 3 things. First, that without proper review, the Mines Rescue Service would risk becoming so chronically underfunded that it would become unable to provide the same stellar level of service to Britain's mines that following coal privatisation it was set up to do in 1996. Second, that were the current funding arrangements to continue, the cost of the MRS on British mining would become prohibitive unless it was subsidised by government. Third, I stated that both of these factors would combine to reduce and diminish the vital mutual cooperative spirit which is at the heart of the Mines Rescue Service and the coal industry in Britain, irreparably changing them for the worse. The coal industry has changed a great deal in the 3 subsequent years. Faced with increasing international competition and dwindling profit margins, more coal mines in the UK have had to shut down. The Mines Rescue Service has been forced to change its funding structure as a consequence in order to still provide a service to British mines, but not to impinge too badly on its viability. But under new regulations, the few remaining mines in Britain will no longer be obliged to pay a levy to the Mines Rescue Service and instead will have a commercial relationship with a suitable provider should a disaster occur. The MRS has evolved to become a successfully run enterprise able to diversify and rely on fees from its other work. In 1996, the MRS levy on each mine was able to cover its core costs, but the relentless closure of British mines since means that the coal levy now only accounts for 11% of the Mines Rescue Service budget, and even this is predicted to drop to 7% next year. This clearly impacts on the capability of the MRS to carry out its vital mines emergency service. Indeed, I strongly suspect that the MRS centre at Dinas in the Rhondda Valley may have to be closed and its facilities transferred perhaps to Mansfield in England because there are no longer sufficient South Wales mines to fund it. Since 1996, the MRS has not received a penny of support from the government. In the heyday of British coal, it had, of course, the resources to deliver a universal rescue service. Even after privatisation, mines paid the levy because it did not affect their profitability. Instead, a mutually cooperative understanding ensured that aid would come if an accident occurred in their mine. The MRS scheme covered the costs of funding when they were called into action, and additional costs fell to the mine or to nearby mines. For 3 weeks after the accident, when the Gleision mine was investigated, the HSE became responsible for keeping the mine open because Gleision's owners, MNS, could not afford to do so. Under normal circumstances, the costs of investigation and rescue would be placed on the mining business in question. However, the finances of the MNS company were so precarious that this was simply not feasible. Such a scenario had never been encountered before by the Health and Safety Executive and the Mines Inspectorate, and they deserve a great deal of credit for ensuring that a full investigation was carried out despite experiencing budget cuts. Yet they should not have been put in this position. Although the MRS has a team of core rescue specialists, it relies heavily on the mutual cooperation of other British mines to provide their own men to aid the rescue effort, as well as equipment and resources. In 2011, as I've said, these were provided by Walter Energy and Unity, two mining companies nearby in my constituency and the unsung heroes of the disaster. However, this rescue effort was much more fragile than it appeared. The cooperative ethos, which is the foundation of the MRS, is based on a pooling of fiscal and technical resources in the event of an accident, and was built upon the foundations provided by the Coal Board's Central Fund. Yet Gleision clearly exposed flaws in the mutual cooperation model, which were not envisaged when the scheme was set up. The financial costs of keeping the mine safely open to enable South Wales Police and the HSE investigators fell on the shoulders of the Health and Safety Executive, together with Walter Energy and Unity, who were also sacrificing men and equipment to investigators, and this was a heavy burden. By Friday the 16th of September, the day after the tragedy, Walter Energy alone had covered the cost for the recovery and investigation of £77,645, yet by December had still received no recompense. Last year they laid off over 100 men, and the Aberpergam pit has since been on care and maintenance. So has Unity Mine, both victims of the falling price of coal, and yet they were both essential to the rescue effort. Because of all this, if there were ever to be a future Gleision-type accident, both a rescue and a full investigation might not be feasible. When I was Secretary of State for Work and Pensions in 2007-8, the HSE's budget was £215 million. By last year, it had been cut by 50 million, or a quarter, to 165 million. Unless the government provides more money for mines rescue and the Health and Safety Executive, accidents in mining will be more frequent, as self-policing health and safety and self-funding rescue and investigation services are no longer viable or fit for purpose. I was one of the many community leaders who, over those long hours, observed the heroic and dedicated efforts of mines rescue workers, supported by highly professional police officers, other emergency workers, and mines inspectors. I'm full of praise for all of them. None of us knew at the time that there was never a chance of rescuing the men who died. But at least their bodies were recovered in dark, dangerous, and filthy conditions. The families of Philip, David, Gary, and Charles have conducted themselves with dignity and deserve enormous praise from all. They do not seek vengeance and scapegoats, and nor do I. All they have asked for is justice, but they've still not received that. In his letter from January 2012, the Secretary of State assured me there would be lessons learnt from the Gleision accident. We await the impending report by the Health and Safety Executive, and I trust it will not be constrained by the trial verdict, because if it is, the inspectors will not be able to reveal what I believe to be their professional conclusions, which I strongly suspect broadly coincide with mine. The 15th of September 2011 would have been an unremarkable day in the history of the Swansea Valley had proper health and safety practice been followed. Yet we still have no answers as to why Gary, Charles, Philip, and David died, why they were heading straight for the water that killed them, why no precaution against inrush scheme was implemented. The Gleision tragedy should not have happened. That is what makes it not simply a terrible accident, but a shocking, terrible scandal.
Before calling the Minister, can I say this debate can continue until 5:15. Mark Harper.
I'm grateful, Mr Chope, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I pay tribute to the right honourable gentleman for securing the debate. It's very helpful to be able to debate some of these issues in the House, particularly with his honourable friends who are very experienced in these matters. And as he said, it was a tragic accident on the 15th of September 2011 which resulted in the deaths of the 4 miners, Charles Breslin, David Powell, Philip Hill and Gary Jenkins. I can remember the events myself. My own constituency is one where there is a mining history, albeit the last large pit closed in 1965, but there are a number of miners, free miners, who still work in small mines. So I remember the issue, and I can only imagine the heart-rending situation faced by the families, and I think he's right to pay tribute to all that they've gone through, and I know it's obviously on behalf of them that he raises these issues in the House. I only mention my own constituency because when we come on just to talk a little bit about the changes to the regulations in the Mines Rescue Service, I've had some experience myself. As I said, I have a number of small mines in my own constituency. I've had some experience thanks to an excellent constituent of mine, Rich Daniels, who's president of the Free Miners, actually going down one of those mines, and so seeing how those small mines operate and actually having the opportunity to talk to him about the health and safety challenges. And also my own constituency has the same issues with the Mines Rescue Service and its viability, and putting in place alternative arrangements that would have a safe and secure method of rescuing miners if such a tragedy happened. So I'll come on to that later in my remarks. As the Right Honourable Gentleman said, the accident triggered a rescue operation of a type not seen before. There was immense commendation for all those who contributed to efforts to save the miners, and he was right to pay tribute to the emergency services, other mine operators and their staff, cave diver volunteers and many others. And it was tragic that it quickly became clear that the task was one of recovery rather than one of rescue. South Wales Police assumed primacy from the outset, and the investigation was led by the police throughout, with technical and other support from the HSE mines inspectors and other individuals and organisations. And the site investigation concluded when all reasonable lines of inquiry had been followed and closed. As he knows, after the investigation concluded, the Crown Prosecution Service brought manslaughter charges against the mine manager and the mine owner, and those members present will know that there was a 3-month trial earlier this year, which, as the Right Honourable Gentleman said, concluded when the jury delivered not guilty verdicts on both the mine manager and the corporate defendant, the mine owner. And the decision of the court must be respected, and obviously I can't today, and it would be inappropriate as a minister to do so, delve and try and reopen the case. I can say, though, now the legal processes are concluded, the HSE are producing a report that will be published, and it will pull together in one place the details of the site investigation that they carried out and the lessons that can be learnt for the future. And I know that's one of the things that the Right Honourable Gentleman wants to make sure happens, of course.
On that specific point, he'll have noticed that I said, because I'm worried about this, that the HSE report will be constrained by the trial verdict. And I'm worried that the HSE report will not be able to be as open as perhaps, for all I know, the mines inspectorates would like to be about their views about what really happened. Can he do whatever he can to try and ensure that that barrier, if it is there, as I suspect it is taken away?
Well, what the report can do is set out the results of the investigation. It can set out the facts that those who inspected with their professional judgment found in the mine. What it can't do is rerun or revisit the questions that were investigated at the trial and the jury's conclusions. So, and I was listening carefully to what he said. I fear that what he wants the HSE to be able to do in its report, which I don't think it can do, is answer questions about what were in the minds of the mine manager and those working about the direction that they proceeded in. I mean, it simply can't revisit those questions. My understanding is those were issues that were dealt with at the trial. Evidence was put forward on both sides of the argument. The jury reached a verdict, and that's something that the HSE cannot reopen in its report and its investigation, of course.
Yeah, I'm not asking for that. I'm certainly not asking for them to read into the minds of those who were including the mine manager who were mining at the time. I'm simply asking him to try and create circumstances in which the mines inspectors in the HSE report can confirm that they suspect that the water indeed, as I've said in my speech, was where the mine plan said it was, and that there was therefore a catastrophic misjudgment made. For what reason and how, it would be impossible to speculate. I readily accept that, but it was made nonetheless.
Well, what they will be able to do is they will be able to set out what the evidence that they got from the site investigation says. What they can't do is revisit questions that were dealt with at the trial. Let me just reply to the Honourable. It's his debate, and then of course I'll listen to the Honourable Gentleman's intervention. What they can't do is rerun the trial and effectively come up with a re-answer the question that was dealt with at the trial and come up with either the same or a different answer. That's not possible. I listened to what he said. I mean, I'm sure they will endeavour to make sure they can go as far as they can in setting out the evidence, the facts that they found on the ground. But what they may not be able to do is speculate about things they simply can't know. They have to stick to what the evidence says. Of course, I'll take an intervention.
There's a big difference between the individuals being charged with corporate manslaughter and being charged of being guilty of an offence as compared to what my honourable friend's referring to, and that's basically the causation of the accident. And the causation of the accident is something which can be investigated completely different, but using the same evidence which is being used in court for a criminal investigation. It's common sense that that would be the case.
Well, as I said, I haven't seen the report. I don't know what it's going to say, but the Mines Inspectorate will use their professional expertise to set out the evidence from the site, the thorough site investigation that took place. But what they can't do is rerun the trial. So the water issue, for example, everybody, I think it's not disputed that the water was there at the time of the incident. What was disputed in court was that the water was there all at the time. And the Right Honourable Gentleman mentioned that there was a debate about the mine manager having given evidence that he'd inspected the old workings. So what the HSE is not going to be able to do is settle questions that were dealt with at the trial and where a conclusion couldn't be reached. That's all I'm saying. So they will endeavour at the best of their professional judgment to set out the evidence, what was found from the investigation. I haven't seen the report. I don't know what it is going to say. It is in process. The final point I was going to say about the report, just on timing, it will be into the new year. I hope early in the new year that report will be published, and as I say, it will be published for everybody to see, and I hope it will therefore set out some lessons that can be learned from this tragedy. Of course.
I think it's been very generous in giving way. I think this is the whole crux of why we're here today. If this was a one-off and never ever happened before, we'd probably feel a lot more comfortable. Whereas I said before, this wasn't a one-off. It had happened previously, and my own friend mentioned regulations in 1979 which were supposed to address this. So what we're talking about, it's all right saying let's learn the lessons. A lesson learned is no use unless it's then applied. And the worry that we've got is, and this hopefully can be tightened up in the report if the HSE decides to do so, is how can we ensure that things like this, as far as is humanly possible, don't happen again by making sure that because clearly, if it's being said that the gentleman went in, he did the investigation, he found there's no water there, that should have raised concerns because where's the water gone to? That should have been followed up. And it's that sort of worry that we have on this side. It could happen again. So just generally not being tight enough.
Well, I think the point the Honourable Gentleman makes actually, which is helpful, because I was going to move on to the work that's been done to shortly bring forward new mine safety legislation, which ensures clear duties on the operators of mines to manage the risks. That work was instigated independently of the Gleision accident. It arose from the independent review of health and safety legislation by Professor Lofstadt, which reported in November 2011. But we have taken into account what happened in this incident as we've been developing this new law. Now, the current law that governs this area of safety in mines covers 40 pieces of legislation, some dating back as far as 1954, as the Right Honourable Gentleman said, where the coal industry was vastly different from today. And there's been, as well as that huge change in the coal sector, there's been a big shift in the wider health and safety framework and the old mine safety legislation needs renewing. HSE has been undertaking a review of that for the last 2 years, and there will be new mines regulations introduced in April next year. They consolidate the key requirements for the control of risks that are inherent to underground mining, as the Right Honourable Gentleman said, including managing the risk of water inrushes, which was clearly the major issue at Gleision. Mine operators will remain legally bound to determine if there is water around workings and to assess the risk of that water causing harm to mine workers. And the new regulations place duties for the first time on the mine operator rather than, as at present, on the mine manager, and they also require the other principal risks in mining to be controlled also, and they make clear and simple requirements on operators to ensure that adequate rescue arrangements are made. The current requirement for coal mines to belong to an approved scheme isn't being carried forward. The Right Honourable Gentleman mentioned this. That scheme was designed and introduced when there were 65 coal mines operating. They all contributed fees to fund it and resources, as he rightly says, as part of their commitment to mutual assistance. And there are simply insufficient mines to fund those arrangements. And I actually looked into this in a very detailed way, not just now, but also as a result of my own constituency experience. The new duty will ensure that mine operators have a duty to ensure that if there needs to be a rescue of workers in any foreseeable scenario, it will be available and workable, and coal mines will be required to make their own arrangements for rescue provision tailored to the risks in each particular mine. Mine operators can use whatever third-party services may be appropriate to those risks, and HSE's mines inspectors have a programme of interventions between now and the new regulations coming into force, which will check the arrangements that mines will have in place from April. The current law is riven with requirements to notify or otherwise seek the permission of the regulator to undertake certain activities. It's not the role of the regulator to oversee day-to-day operations in that way. Regulation of other major hazard industries, very successfully, requires duty holders to demonstrate that their risk assessments and their control systems are in place and, importantly, robust, so that they adequately manage risk to protect both their employees and the wider community. And the new regulations take a similar approach in the mining sector. And HSE inspectors are talking to mine operators and trade unions in the period leading up to the new regulations to make sure that everyone is clear about how they implement and comply with the regulations. So those new regulations retain all the key controls over the hazards which this tragedy and the Right Honourable Gentleman have reminded us are involved in mining, but they deliver a modern risk-based regime that will drive mine operators to continuously improve the management of the risks involved in mining. The tragedy, such as the one powerfully set out by the Right Honourable Gentleman, shows us why we shouldn't ever be complacent, but we should avoid incidents happening again. So what I will say to the Honourable Gentleman, I just had one more point. Let me just say briefly one more point, which I think was worth me mentioning. On the issue of the inquests, which was raised by the Honourable Member for Wansbeck, what I will do, my understanding is they haven't been restarted following the trial. There hasn't been a formal notification to the HSE that they've actually been closed. What I will do is contact colleagues at the Ministry of Justice, make inquiries about what the plan is with those inquests, whether they're going to be restarted, whether they're going to be formally concluded, and I'll write to the Honourable Gentleman and the two other members present with his permission and set out the position.
I'm really very grateful that he's offered that. Could he say that it's my strong view, could he say that it's my strong view that that should be resumed?
Of course.
There should be a full inquest.
No, I will write to contact colleagues in the Ministry of Justice, and I'll put on record to them that the constituency MP's strong view is they should be resumed. I have to say I'm not familiar with the legal rules around this. I don't know what the position is. I'll contact colleagues in the Ministry of Justice and then I'll write to him, and because of their interest in this, the other two members present, and set out what the position is. And I hope that's helpful and at least will go some way to meeting the concerns of the families who, as he says, have conducted themselves with great dignity in this process. And I hope that is at least some small measure of comfort. And I thank him for raising it in the House today.